A man who stole $200,000 in the 1970s and then jumped out of a plane, the world's most famous street artist, and the Babushka lady. All of this on today's most amazing top 10 list. Coming at number 10, we have D.B. Cooper. Let's kick off this list with a famous one. D.B. Cooper pulled off one of the most famous hijackings in history and disappeared without a trace. The dude got on a plane, was headed to Seattle, and sat down in his seat. The year was 1971, so he ordered a bourbon and drunk it down. Partway through the flight, he called over the flight attendant and slipped her a note. On the note, it said that he had a bomb in his bag and he was ready to blow it up if they didn't set him up with $200,000 when the plane landed. Someone came on board after the plane landed and gave him his money, and then he let go some of the hostages. But now there was a second part to his plan. He told the pilot to take off again and fly for Mexico. While in the air and over a forest in Portland, he took his money and a parachute and then jumped out the back of the plane. From that moment, he was never seen again. Some people think he must have died somewhere in that forest. Other people think that he made his great escape and was never seen again. But to this day, no one knows the real identity of the man known as D.B. Cooper. Coming in at number 9, we have HAKIM. Although we all know who HAKIM was, we have no idea what happened to his body, which to this day has never been identified, and we have no idea why he left his empire. It all still stands a mystery. HAKIM was the ruler of the Fat Mid-Destiny in the 11th century. Many people were suspicious about him, that he might have been suffering from some sort of mental illness. He would make laws that didn't really make any sense. Some of them would benefit his people, and others were just strange restrictions that seemed to come out of nowhere. Like at one point, he made it illegal for cobblers to make shoes for women. Maybe this dude was a believer in the healthy practice of walking around barefoot? I don't know. But then out of nowhere, one day he was gone. He just got up and left and was never seen again. What a wild thing to do, just to get up and leave your whole kingdom. He was just like, yeah, I'm done with this life. I'm gonna go be a nomad. Coming in at number 8, we have John Doe, number 24. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be lost walking around in a foreign place, or at least in a place where you don't understand anything. That must be terrifying. Well, unfortunately, that's what happened to John Doe 24. He was seen walking around the streets of Jacksonville, Illinois. He was trying to find his way around, but he caught people's eye because of how young he was. He couldn't have been any older than a teenager. After quite a bit of time of walking around alone, someone tried to help him, but it turns out that he had no way of communicating and he was actually deaf. Eventually, he was taken in, and after bouncing around for a little while in the legal system, he was put into a mental institution. For the rest of his life, he would bounce from institution to institution, and even though the only word he could ever write down was Lewis, he was only ever known as John Doe number 24. He then died in 1994, and no one ever knew his name or who he was. Coming in at number 7, we have George Mallory and Andrew Irvine. Another point of some people that we knew, but we have no idea what happened to them. These two men went missing back in 1924. They were two mountaineers that were leading an expedition to be the first people ever to make it to the peak of Mount Everest. Could you imagine doing something like that back in 1924? That would be like making it to Mars now. Well, they were doing a pretty good job. The team was close to the peak, and then the two of them decided that they would do the final leg on their own. They were making their way to the top of the mountain, and then the clouds moved in, and the rest of the party lost sight of them. From that day on, they were never seen again. It's suspected that they made it to the top of the mountain and died before they were able to make it back down. There were a couple of bodies that were discovered years later, but it's unknown if they belong to these two explorers. For all we know, they became the first two men to make it to the peak, and a couple of aliens came down and then took them off in a spaceship so they could live among the Illuminati legends who get to live as immortals in space for doing great things. Coming at number 6, we have DRIFF, a man who was working behind the scenes making unique stories for famous people that no one has ever seen the face of. He was even prosecuted for some devious crimes that we can't talk about on this channel because they're a little too graphic, but even after a whole case taking place and him walking away innocent, his identity still has never been revealed. Xavier DRIFF is the most common name used for this person, and he has been dealing books to the rich and famous ever since the 80s. People suspect that he could be more than one person, and that the stories that he's writing for these people could have details to some crimes. Oh, it's wild to think what the super rich are doing behind the scenes. I always thought there has to be some sort of a Kumite blood sport fight league that's going on behind the scenes, where the best fighters in the world that we don't even know about fight for the pleasure of the rich and famous. If I ever get famous enough, I will find out, and I will let you guys know. Coming at number 5, we have Banksy. You must have been living under a rock if you have not heard of Banksy, but this man is probably the most famous street artist of all time. He is hands down one of the most famous artists of all time. But even though this guy has been spray painting art out in public and in some of the most famous places in the world, he still has never been found. He even pulled off one of the most famous art stunts I have ever seen, and believe you me, I have seen my fair share of art stunts. There was a framed Banksy painting that was being sold at auction, and I guess the painting had one stipulation: it was never allowed to be sold at auction. So as soon as the painting was purchased, it self-destructed. The frame that the painting was being held in was actually a secret shredder. That's a very sneaky move, Banksy, but that makes you wonder, how did he know when to put this thing through the shredder? Was he there? Coming in at number 4, we have Jerome of Sandy Cove. Now, a nice Canadian story for you. Back in the year 1863, there was a boy walking around in Nova Scotia, Canada. He came across a random dude that was very hard to miss, mainly because he was missing both of his legs. The boy ran home to get his parents because it was freezing that day. They came and picked up this man and then took him in and tried to figure out who he was, but he couldn't speak. He got the name Jerome from grunting noises he would make when people would ask him what his name was. It took some time, but no one could ever figure out who this man was. He was then sent off to New Brunswick to meet up with a man who spoke 5 different languages, but still nothing. He lived there for 7 years before moving off again. This time it would be to a farm where he would live out the rest of his days. And this entire time he never spoke a word, and no one ever found out who this man was or what happened to his legs. Something very interesting about his missing legs is that they seem to have been removed by a surgeon not long before he was found by the boy on the coast of Sandy Cove. Coming at number 3, we have the gray-skinned man. Back in the 1970s, a couple driving through Australia decided that they would pull over for a moment and appreciate the view, but they found something that wasn't so pleasant to look at. There was a body laying in the dirt. At first, they suspected that this person was dead, but after a closer inspection, they learned that this man was very much alive. He was still breathing, but there was something very strange about him. He seemed to have gray skin and strangely colored eyes. They brought him to the hospital, and the doctors were perplexed by this person. It seemed that his biology was different from a normal human. His organs were all in the wrong places, but he was still somehow alive. But no matter what they tried, it seemed that he kept getting closer and closer to death. For a moment, the doctors left the room, and then when they came back, he was gone. There were never reports of this man again, and no one knows what happened to him. Did he get up and run away, or did some men in black confiscate the body when people weren't looking? Coming in number 2, we have the Babushka lady. The Kennedy assassination is still one of the most mysterious moments in history. There are so many loose ends you could go crazy trying to dig out the truth, but there was one lady who might have had the evidence as to what happened on that day, but we have no idea who she was. On the famous Zapruder footage that showed Kennedy being assassinated, there was a small woman wearing a babushka who was in the perfect eyeline of the grassy knoll. She would have been able to see if there was a second shooter that day. What is even more pressing about this matter is that she had a camera on her, and if she was taking pictures, we would have been able to identify if there was a second person with Lee Harvey Oswald. But to this day, no one knows who she is. And coming at the number 1 spot, we have Jack the Ripper. This still stands as one of the most famous serial killer cases of all time. The year is 1888, and several women were found brutally dismembered. It would seem that someone came up behind them and cut their throat, and as they were bleeding out, this person started to dissect them and take out their internal organs. At first, Scotland Yard thought this could have been killings at random with none of them linked together, but then they received a letter titled From Hell. This went into detail about these crimes that were committed and how the person felt as they were doing it and how much they enjoyed it. Even then, Scotland Yard thought this could have been a hoax that was dreamt up by the newspaper. They sent in a letter, the town gets word that there's a killer on the loose named Jack the Ripper, and then you start selling newspapers like hotcakes. But Scotland Yard started to take it seriously when they got another letter sent to them with a human kidney. The identity of this fiend was never unveiled, but it's suspected that they were a surgeon or doctor with the precision that they cut into the bodies. Alright guys, that has been our list. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I've been your host, JEROME, and until next time, keep enjoying this content. Bye.